My presentation will be a comparison of state and federal regulation of PFAS. My name is Olivia Deans, and I am an Ocean and Coastal Law Fellow with the National Sea Grant um, Law Center, and my co-author is Catherine Janesy, who is the Senior Research Counsel at the Law Center. So for this presentation, I will be discussing the regulation of PFAS and give an overview of federal and state regulation. And I chose to focus on states in the Great Lakes region, mainly Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. Okay, thanks. So as you may know from other presentations or your background, PFAS are a family of emerging contaminants and can include hundreds of individual compounds. And these compounds accumulate in the environment and have been linked to various health issues. So this is a recent map from January this year showing where communities have tested and found the presence of PFAS in drinking water. So I'll start with federal regulation. There are many different mechanisms that the federal government can use and has been using to regulate PFAS. And that authority can come from different statutes. So I'll just go over a few of those, but this is a non-exhaustive list. So the first is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this act regulates standards for public drinking water sources for the purpose of protecting public health. And under this act, EPA has the authority to regulate water contaminants in sources of drinking water. And it does this by setting a maximum contaminant level. And once that contaminant level is reached, there are penalties and avenues for relief if the chemical exceeds that level. And it also requires monitoring of drinking water. Another action EPA may take under this act is to set health advisories. And I think it's important to note that these health advisories are not binding, they're recommendations. So there's not really a penalty under this statute for exceeding them. The second statute, and probably the most well-known, is the Clean Water Act. And under the Clean Water Act, the EPA has authority to set limitations on a pollutant that specify a level of permissible discharge. So the standard is meant to be set at a reduction level that may be achieved by the best available technology or a similar standard. The next mechanism for federal regulation could be the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And under TSCA, the EPA might regulate PFAS through what is called the Significant New Use Rule. And under this rule, if EPA classifies a chemical use as a significant new use, then that would require monitoring, review, and notice requirements about how the chemical may affect humans or the environment. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, is another statute that provides federal funds to clean up sites where there might be contamination. So for example, EPA could set guidelines for remediating groundwater contaminated with PFAS at these CERCLA sites. Finally, one other mechanism that's probably not always the first thought of, or at least for me, I don't think of it first, but that would be the Clean Air Act. And under the Clean Air Act, EPA has authority to designate hazardous air pollutants for chemicals that might impact human health or the environment. So I wanted to just give a status of federal PFAS regulation. The federal government has not comprehensively regulated PFAS, and it's only been the last few years that EPA has started to begin the regulation process. So actually way back in 2002, EPA began a priority review, and it invited 8 companies to begin phasing out PFOA and PFOS. And all 8 companies began this phase out, but they did change their manufacturing techniques, so there still is an emittance of PFAS into the environment. In 2016, EPA established health advisories for PFOA and PFOS under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And as I mentioned, health advisories are non-binding, so there's not necessarily a lot of teeth to those rules, and it doesn't necessarily require affirmative steps. So then a couple of years ago in 2019, EPA released a PFAS action plan. And this was a plan that invited public comments on how the agency should categorize and regulate PFAS and what sort of scientific information was still needed. So EPA released the plan in 2019, and then in 2020 began taking steps under that plan. So in last year, February, EPA proposed regulating PFOA and PFOS under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and not just as a health advisory, but as a binding maximum contaminant level. In June, EPA proposed a significant new use rule under TSCA. So as a reminder, this would require notice and reporting requirements for companies. In December, EPA released guidance, so again, not binding yet, for PFAS disposal under their National Defense Authorization Act. And then most recently, and I think probably the most comprehensive step that EPA has taken was in March this spring when EPA issued notice that it was collecting data for what the limitation guidelines and performance standards should be set for PFAS under the Clean Water Act. So also I would note that this most recent action is still open for public comment until May 17th. So that means anyone can still submit information and comments to the agency by that deadline. But I think the March announcement is exciting, and I'm interested to see what EPA publishes for those performance standards. So now turning to state regulation, generally federal regulatory standards act as a floor, and states can enact the ceiling or stricter standards for a contaminant. However, in the absence of federal standards, which is kind of where we are right now, states can take a variety of regulatory approaches. And I'm going to be highlighting 3 of those. A state may regulate through a statute enacted by the legislator or through regulations and rulemaking procedures conducted by that state agency. And I think this rulemaking procedure is important because it allows for public comments and input from stakeholders in the scientific community about those limits and what actions the agency should be taking. So I'll start with Minnesota. Minnesota is potentially regulating PFAS through a class hazardous substance mechanism. So currently Minnesota does not have a state water quality standard set for PFAS. And this standard would kind of be set under the Clean Water Act. Minnesota has issued advisory values for PFOS through its Department of Health, and those values are set at 15 parts per trillion. And like the EPA health advisory, these limits are recommendations and not legally enforceable. The standard for this level was set at a limit that is likely to pose little or no risk to human health. And for comparison, this level is much stricter than the EPA advisory level of 70 parts per trillion. So you can see it's a very small amount. This February, new legislation was introduced to address PFAS within the state. So even though that plan and that legislation is not yet enacted, if it is passed, Minnesota would become the second state to regulate the entire class of PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance. And that plan also includes mandatory disclosure requirements and monitoring requirements. Next is Michigan, and Michigan has taken a different approach and established enforceable drinking water standards under state law. So as I note on the slide, this is different than many other states' non-binding or non-enforceable advisory limits. Michigan does have those legally enforceable standards. So the agency published maximum contaminant levels for 7 PFAS chemicals, and those chemicals are listed on the right of the slide there. And this rule was enacted from authority stemming from the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act, and that final rule took effect in August last year, so it is still relatively new. And the gist of the rule is that it sets standards for drinking water and groundwater and requires monitoring of public water supplies. Finally, the last state I want to talk about is New York. In 2016, New York became the first state to regulate PFOA as a hazardous substance and subsequently regulated PFOS. So note that for New York, a hazardous substance designation has different compliance standards than, say, the Michigan or Minnesota drinking water standards. I would characterize them as stricter because instead of setting a limit for how much can be released, a hazardous substance designation requires stricter standards like proper storage and monitoring of a chemical, and it needs to have authorization in order to be released at all, even in small quantities. There are some exceptions, for example, firefighting foam. And additionally, New York has set maximum contaminant levels for PFOA and PFOS at 10 parts per trillion, which is again much stricter than the EPA limit of 70 parts per trillion. New York also requires testing and monitoring for contaminant levels, but it's in a phased approach where currently water systems serving 10,000 or more people are required to test for contaminant levels. And then one other thing, there is a current bill to regulate concentrations of PFOA in the air and not through water quality standards. So overall, I would just say that there's not a comprehensive national regulation of PFAS. However, we are seeing the EPA actively engage in beginning to regulate PFAS. So in this absence of federal regulation, states have taken a variety of approaches, and I think there are pros and cons to each approach. And I hope that this comparison is a way for states to find the best approach and compare what has worked and what hasn't.
3 minutes, Olivia.
Thank you. So as I covered, some states have set advisory values, some have set enforceable drinking water standards. Minnesota is potentially regulating PFAS as a class of substances, where New York has regulated some PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance. So we will likely see stricter and more comprehensive federal regulation emerging, hopefully even this year. EPA has been the agency leading this federal approach, and especially with an administration change this year, EPA may speed up or put more emphasis on PFAS in the future. We'll just have to see. And so if there is more federal regulation enacted, states may have to adjust their standards in the future if the federal standards become more stricter. So thank you. I've included a link to the Law Center Water webpage as along with our emails in case there are any questions to follow up. So thanks again.
Thanks very much, Olivia. Janice, do we have any questions?
Looks like we have one. Is there an expectation for the US EPA regulation and standards in the near or distant future?
Yes, hopefully we don't know for sure this year, but because they did propose those they opened up comments for standards this spring in March. So after public comments are received, hopefully we see the agency publish at least initial guidelines this year.
Is that the only one, Janice?
Yes, it is.
So I have a question. I'm just wondering, and maybe this is outside your area of expertise, but given your familiarity with the legislation, I just thought I would throw it out there that, a lot of these states are, and the federal government, are starting to enact, a lot more monitoring programs because they're setting these levels, but sometimes without a lot of legislation for who's responsible for cleanup, if and when it's found. And so I was just wondering if you had any insight or had seen any insight into sort of that type of legislation.
I don't have a lot of information on that. I know there is a federal avenue for that cleanup under CERCLA, but that tends to be really challenging to go through that process. But one example I've seen is Wisconsin is in has introduced a bill to help municipalities with monitoring requirements and then kind of head the way in those cleanup if drinking water sources are found to be contaminated. But I'm sure there are other examples that I'm not aware of.
That's good to hear, though, at least that it's not just go out and find it and then there's no money to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Olivia.